I had just buried my wife when her phone buzzed. One message appeared on the cracked screen. The Black Cookbook, Storage Unit 11. Do not let him see. My blood ran cold. I was standing right beside her fresh grave in the freezing Chicago rain. Before I continue this story, take a deep breath, because what I am about to tell you is something I never imagined would happen in my own family. If you have ever been betrayed by the people you sacrificed everything for, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. It gives me strength to know I am not alone. Now let me take you back to that bitter afternoon. The rain in Chicago has a way of cutting right through your clothes straight to the bone. But the chill I felt that day was not from the weather. It was from the gaping hole in the earth right in front of me. I am Richard Caldwell. For 40 years I worked as a structural engineer. I spent my entire life calculating load-bearing walls tension and the exact amount of steel needed to ensure that massive buildings would never collapse. I knew how to build things that would last forever. But as I stood there watching the mahogany casket being lowered into the muddy ground, I realized I had failed to protect the foundation of my own life. Patricia and I were married for 45 years. 45 years. You think you know a person after that long? You think you know their every habit, every sigh, every small smile. My Patricia was a gentle woman. She spent her days tending to her rose bushes in the backyard and baking apple pies that made the whole neighborhood smell like cinnamon and sugar. She was the heart of our home. She was not a woman of mystery. She did not have dark secrets, or so I believed. I stood there under a large black umbrella, shivering in my dark wool coat. I looked across the open grave at my children. My son Derek stood tall and immaculate in a tailored designer suit that probably cost more than my first car. He is a real estate developer, always flashy, always talking about his next big deal. Next to him was his wife Megan, shivering in the cold, but making sure everyone saw her expensive leather gloves and designer handbag. They looked like they belonged in a magazine, not a muddy cemetery. Then there was my daughter Sarah. She works as an administrative director at a large city hospital. She was dabbing her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the devastated perfect daughter. Her husband Brian stood slightly behind her, quiet and unremarkable, holding her umbrella. He was a man who had failed at 3 different businesses, always living in the shadow of my successful children. I looked at all of them, the family I had built. My hands, heavily scarred and calloused from decades of working with rebar and concrete, gripped the handle of my umbrella. I had worked 80-hour weeks. I had breathed in toxic cement dust and ruined my knees on construction sites just to pay for Derek and Sarah to attend the best private universities. I gave them everything so they would not have to struggle the way I did. They were supposed to be my proudest achievements. The priest was reading the final blessing. The words blurred together in the cold wind. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. I reached my free hand into the deep pocket of my coat to find a handkerchief. Instead, my fingers brushed against cold glass and metal. It was Patricia's old smartphone. I had slipped it into my pocket that morning. I could not bear to turn it off or put it away in a drawer just yet. I wanted to keep it close to my chest, maybe to look at her photos later when the house became too quiet. I assumed the battery was practically dead. I assumed no one would be texting a dead woman during her burial. Suddenly, the phone vibrated. It was not a soft notification. It was a violent, sharp buzz against my ribs. It startled me so much I almost dropped my umbrella. I quickly pulled my hand out of my pocket, keeping the phone shielded from the rain and hidden beneath the dark canopy of the umbrella. I tapped the screen. The brightness hurt my tired eyes in the gloomy afternoon light. It was a text message, but it was not from a friend offering condolences. It was from an unknown, blocked number. And looking closer, I realized it was an automated scheduled message. Someone had programmed this text to be sent at this exact date and time, the day of her funeral. I squinted through my reading glasses and read the words that would ultimately destroy everything I thought I knew. The Black Cookbook, Storage Unit 11. Do not let him see. I stopped breathing. The cemetery faded away. The sound of the rain hitting the umbrellas around me became a dull hum. I read the words again, my engineering mind desperately trying to make sense of the data. The Black Cookbook, Storage Unit 11. Do not let him see. Why would Patricia, a woman who rarely left our suburb, have a storage unit? And where was Unit 11? But the most terrifying part of that message was the last sentence. Do not let him see. Who was him? A slow, creeping dread wrapped around my throat. A scheduled text meant this was planned. A delayed trigger. A dead man switch. My wife had known she was going to die. She had prepared for it. And she was hiding something from someone. I slowly lifted my head and looked across the grave again. Derek was checking his expensive watch, looking bored and impatient. Sarah was whispering something to Megan, her eyes dry now. Brian was staring directly at the casket, completely still. One of the men standing near me could be the reason my wife was dead. One of them might be the him she was so terrified of. I slid the phone back into my coat pocket, my knuckles turning white. I was no longer just a grieving widower. I was a man standing on a collapsing bridge, and I needed to find out who pulled the support beams. Tonight, I had to find that cookbook. The drive back from the cemetery was an absolute blur. The mourners had gathered at the house for the reception, eating the catered sandwiches and offering empty platitudes. I nodded. I shook hands. I played the part of the grieving widower perfectly. But beneath my quiet exterior, a violent storm was raging. My mind kept returning to the phone in my pocket. The phone that felt heavier than a block of lead. By 10 o'clock, the last guest had finally left. Derek and Megan were the first to make their excuses, claiming they had an early flight for a business trip. Sarah and Brian lingered a bit longer, packing up the leftover food before retreating to their own lives. The moment I heard the front door click shut behind them, the mask dropped. The silence of the empty house was deafening, but I had no time to mourn. I had a job to do. I walked straight into the kitchen, taking off my suit jacket and rolling up my sleeves. The text message had been specific. The Black Cookbook. Patricia loved to cook. We had an entire bookshelf in the corner of the kitchen dedicated to her culinary collection. Binders of handwritten recipes passed down from her grandmother, glossy hardcover books by celebrity chefs, and worn paperbacks she had picked up at garage sales over the years. I started there. I pulled every single book off the shelf, throwing them onto the hardwood floor. I flipped through the pages, shaking them, looking for a hidden note or a black cover. Nothing. I moved to the pantry. I tore through the cereal boxes, the canned goods, the bags of flour and sugar. I emptied the drawers, dumping silverware and spatulas onto the counters. The kitchen, usually immaculate, looked like a hurricane had ripped through it. Still nothing. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Was it a code? Was I misunderstanding her message? I stood in the center of the wreckage, my chest heaving, trying to think like she did. I looked around the room, my eyes scanning every corner. Then my gaze landed on the chest freezer sitting in the corner of the attached garage just beyond the kitchen door. Patricia used it to store meats and bulk items. It was her pride and joy when she prepared for the holidays. I walked over my heavy boots echoing on the concrete floor. I lifted the heavy white lid of the deep freezer. A cloud of icy vapor rolled out, stinging my face. I started pulling things out. Frozen turkeys, vacuum-sealed steaks, bags of frozen vegetables. I threw them carelessly onto the floor. I dug deeper and deeper until my knuckles scraped against the frost-covered bottom. And there, wrapped tightly in 3 layers of thick plastic wrap, wedged beneath a massive block of frozen beef, was a rectangular shape. It did not look like meat. I pulled it out, my fingers numb from the cold, and carried it back to the kitchen island. I grabbed a paring knife and sliced through the layers of plastic wrap. As the plastic peeled away, the dark, worn cover of a book emerged. It was completely black with no title on the spine or the front. The Black Cookbook. I stared at it for a long moment. For 40 years, I was a structural engineer. I spent my days inspecting concrete pillars, steel beams, and the foundations of towering skyscrapers. My job was to find the hidden flaws, the microscopic stress fractures that could bring a 100-story building crashing down to the earth. I know what a cracked foundation looks like. I know the subtle signs of impending collapse. And standing in my kitchen at midnight looking at this frozen book, I realized the foundation of my entire family had been secretly crumbling right beneath my feet. My hands, heavily scarred from decades of tying rebar and pouring concrete, trembled as I reached out and opened the cover. The book was not filled with recipes for pot roast or apple pie. In fact, there were no pages to read at all. The center of the book had been meticulously hollowed out, creating a hidden square compartment inside the thick pages. Sitting inside that carved-out square was a single heavy brass key and a small piece of torn white paper. I picked up the paper. There was a handwritten address in Aurora, a suburb about 40 minutes west of Chicago. Underneath the address in Patricia's neat cursive handwriting was a single line: Unit 11. I did not hesitate. I did not stop to put the frozen food back or clean up the kitchen. I grabbed the brass key, slipped the piece of paper into my pocket, and grabbed my truck keys from the counter. I stepped out into the freezing night. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with a biting cold that cut through my thin sweater. I climbed into my pickup truck, the engine roaring to life in the quiet suburban neighborhood. I backed out of the driveway and sped toward the highway, leaving my empty house and my sleeping neighborhood far behind. The drive out to Aurora felt like a fever dream. The highway was empty, just endless stretches of dark asphalt, illuminated by the harsh yellow glow of the streetlights. My mind was racing, trying to piece together a puzzle with missing edges. Why Aurora? We had no friends there. We had no business there. Why would a woman who spent her weekends knitting sweaters for her future grandchildren need a secret storage unit 40 miles from home? And why did she hide the key under frozen meat? It was the kind of paranoia you see in spy movies, not in the life of a 68-year-old housewife. The closer I got to the address, the tighter the knot in my stomach became. The feeling of impending doom was absolutely suffocating. I pulled off the highway and navigated a series of dimly lit industrial roads. The navigation system led me to an older, neglected commercial zone. Large warehouses surrounded by chain-link fences with barbed wire on top. I finally pulled up to the address. It was a sprawling, single-story self-storage facility. The sign out front was rusted, and the security gate was wide open, hanging crookedly on its hinges. It was exactly the kind of place you would rent if you wanted to remain completely unseen. The gravel crunched loudly under my tires as I drove slowly down the long rows of identical orange metal doors. I passed unit after unit, the numbers painted in fading black stencils. Unit 5, Unit 6, Unit 7. I reached the end of the row and turned the corner. There it was. Unit 11. I parked my truck directly in front of the door, leaving the headlights on to cut through the oppressive darkness. I killed the engine. The silence of the industrial park was eerie, broken only by the distant hum of the highway. I stepped out of the truck, the cold wind whipping around my legs. I walked up to the orange metal door and looked at the heavy steel padlock securing the latch. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the cold brass key. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying, heavy click. I pulled the padlock off and tossed it onto the gravel. I grabbed the metal handle at the bottom of the door, planted my boots firmly on the ground, and heaved upward. The metal door rolled up its tracks with a loud screeching rattle that echoed off the surrounding brick buildings. I braced myself. I fully expected to see stacks of dusty cardboard boxes, maybe some old antique furniture Patricia had been hiding, or perhaps a collection of family heirlooms she did not want the kids to fight over. But as the door rolled all the way to the top, my truck headlights flooded the inside of the unit, and I froze completely. It was not filled with old furniture. It was not a storage space at all. The entire unit was humming with electricity, glowing with the blinking green and blue lights of a massive stacked computer server system. I stood frozen at the threshold of Unit 11. The glaring headlights of my truck illuminated a scene that made absolutely no sense. My gentle wife, the woman who struggled to set the clock on our kitchen microwave, had a secret room that looked like the nerve center of a financial firm. I stepped inside the metal frame. The air conditioning was blasting from a portable corner unit, working overtime to keep the stacked server racks from overheating. I walked slowly past the blinking green and blue lights, my heavy work boots scuffing softly against the bare concrete floor. The hum of the cooling fans was the only sound in the room. In the back half of the unit, sitting under a harsh fluorescent overhead light, was a heavy steel desk. On top of it sat a commercial-grade money counter, the exact kind you see behind the teller glass at a bank. Right next to it was a heavy-duty industrial paper shredder, its clear plastic bin completely full of cross-cut confetti. And against the back cinder-block wall, resting on cheap metal shelving, was a row of thick, black legal binders. I walked toward the shelves. My legs felt like they were made of solid lead. I reached out and grabbed the first binder on the left. It had no label on the spine. I carried it over to the steel desk and flipped it open. The first page was a bank statement. Not just any bank statement. It was a document from the wealth management firm that held my primary retirement portfolio. For 4 decades, I poured every single extra cent I earned into that account. I gave up family vacations. I drove second-hand pickup trucks until the engines literally died, and I packed my own lunches every day, all so that Patricia and I would never have to worry in our old age. I wanted our kids to have a permanent safety net. The balance at the top of the page made my chest tighten painfully. $2.5 million. But that was a statement from 3 years ago. I flipped the page. Another statement dated a few months later. 2 million. I flipped another page. 1.5 million. I began to flip faster, my breathing growing shallow and frantic. The most recent statement, dated just last month, showed a remaining balance of less than $50,000. Over $2 million had vanished, vaporized into thin air. I dug deeper into the binder, flipping past the summary pages. I found wire transfer authorization forms. There were hundreds of them, each one moving $20,000 or $30,000 at a time to an offshore account I did not recognize. I looked at the bottom of the authorization forms. There was my signature, Richard Caldwell. But it was not my signature. It was a brilliant forgery, but an engineer knows his own lines. The loop on the capital letter was slightly too wide. The pressure of the pen stroke on the end was far too light. Someone had been bleeding my life savings dry, drop by drop, over the course of years. I grabbed the next binder from the shelf. My hands were shaking so violently that I dropped it onto the desk. The binder popped open on impact. The first document inside was a property deed. The deed to the house in Chicago. The house I built from the ground up with my own 2 hands. The house where Patricia and I raised Derek and Sarah. Attached to the deed was a massive stack of complex loan documents. A reverse mortgage, maxed out to the absolute limit. Whoever orchestrated this nightmare did not just empty my bank accounts, they leveraged the roof over my head. If the bank called in that loan tomorrow, I would be homeless, a 70-year-old man with nothing but the clothes on his back. I leaned heavily against the cold steel desk, gasping for air as the room spun. The betrayal felt like a physical blow, a sledgehammer striking my ribs. Patricia knew about this. That was what the servers were for. That was what the money counter was for. She was tracking the theft. She was building a case, and she had hidden it here away from the house, away from him. Do not let him see. The terrifying words from the text message burned brightly in my mind. Who had the access to my accounts? Who knew my signature well enough to practice it? Who had the financial background to set up offshore shell companies? My son Derek, the brilliant real estate developer. Or perhaps Sarah, the meticulous hospital administrator with a mind for paperwork. Suddenly, the sharp crunch of tires on gravel broke the silence. I froze completely. The sound was coming from outside the storage facility. An engine rumbled low and aggressive, slowly turning down the long aisle of orange metal doors. They were coming this way. I reached over and violently pulled the chain on the overhead light, plunging the unit into darkness. The only illumination was the eerie, pulsating glow of the computer servers and the headlights of my truck parked outside. I realized my mistake instantly. My truck was sitting right there, a massive beacon announcing my presence. I pressed my back against the cold, cinder block wall, sliding down into the narrow shadow between the server rack and the desk. My heart was beating so loud, I was terrified the sound would give me away. The rumble of the engine grew louder. A pair of bright headlights swept across the open doorway of Unit 11, casting long, distorted shadows across the concrete floor. I held my breath. I waited for the car to stop. I waited for the sound of heavy footsteps on the gravel. I reached into my coat pocket, my fingers wrapping tightly around the small pocket knife I always carried. I am an old man, but I will not go down without a bloody fight. The vehicle crawled slowly past the opening. Through the narrow sliver of light, I caught a brief glimpse of a dark sport utility vehicle. It did not stop. It continued down the gravel path, the sound of the heavy engine slowly fading into the distance as it turned the corner and exited the facility. I let out a ragged breath, my entire body trembling with a mixture of raw adrenaline and burning rage. They did not see me. Not this time. But the message was undeniably clear. I was standing in the middle of a brutal war zone, and I did not even know who the enemy was yet. I turned the overhead light back on. I grabbed the legal binders, shoving them into a heavy canvas duffel bag I found in the corner. I was not leaving this evidence here. I walked out to my truck, tossed the bag onto the passenger seat, and slammed the door. As I drove away, the grief that had consumed me was completely gone. Tomorrow morning, I am going to look my children directly in the eyes. I need to see which one of them flinches first. The sun came up over Chicago, casting long, pale shadows across my empty living room. I had not slept a single wink. I had spent the remaining hours of the night sitting in my leather armchair, staring at the canvas duffel bag I had dragged in from the truck. Inside that bag was the blueprint of my financial execution. At 7 in the morning, I picked up my phone and sent a group text to Derek and Sarah. I told them I was looking through some of their mother's desk drawers for a life insurance policy, and I found something that confused me. I asked them to come over immediately. I kept my tone helpless, playing the part of the frail, bewildered old man they thought I was. They arrived within the hour. Derek walked through the front door first, holding a cup of artisan coffee, looking slightly annoyed at the inconvenience. He was wearing a casual weekend outfit that still managed to look like it belonged in a catalog. Sarah followed closely behind, still wearing her hospital scrubs from what I assumed was a morning shift, though her makeup was absolutely flawless. They found me sitting at the kitchen island. I had poured myself a mug of black coffee, letting it go cold. I made sure my shoulders were hunched. I made sure my hands were visibly trembling. I did not show them the canvas bag. I did not tell them about the storage unit. I only placed one single piece of paper on the marble countertop. It was a copy of the most recent bank statement from my retirement portfolio, the one showing that over $2 million had been completely wiped out. I looked up at my children, letting my eyes water just enough to sell the performance. I pushed the piece of paper across the counter toward Derek. I asked him what this meant. I asked him how the money I had saved for 40 years was just gone. I watched his face very carefully. I watched for the flinch. But Derek was a real estate developer. He negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts for a living. His face was a mask of perfect practiced shock. He picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the numbers, and then he looked at Sarah. They exchanged a heavy, loaded glance. It was a silent conversation between two conspirators who had prepared for this exact moment. Derek slowly placed the paper back onto the counter. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He reached across the marble island and placed his manicured hand over my rough, calloused one. And then my son began to cry. It was not a subtle display. Real tears welled up in his eyes and spilled down his cheeks. His voice cracked with perfectly calibrated emotion. He looked at me with an expression of profound, agonizing pity. "Dad," he whispered, his voice shaking. "We did not want you to find out like this. We were trying to fix it before you ever had to know." I asked him what he was talking about, keeping my voice small and fragile. Sarah stepped forward, wrapping her arm around Derek's shoulder. She looked at me with sad, sympathetic eyes. She told me that 2 years ago they had discovered a terrible secret. She claimed that their mother, my sweet Patricia, had developed a severe online gambling addiction. Derek took over the story, wiping his eyes. He said Patricia had started playing high-stakes poker on offshore websites late at night. He said she lost control, chasing her losses until she had completely drained my retirement accounts. He claimed she came to him crying, terrified that I would divorce her if I ever found out the truth. He squeezed my hand tighter, looking me dead in the eye. He said he and Sarah had been secretly taking out loans to cover her massive debts. He told me the reverse mortgage on the house was Patricia's desperate attempt to pay off the illegal gambling syndicates she owed. He painted a picture of a woman spiraling out of control, driven mad by addiction. He said they lied to me to protect her image, to ensure that I would always remember her as the wonderful wife she was, rather than the woman who destroyed our family's financial future. As I listened to him speak, a cold chill ran down my spine. Not because I believed him, but because of how incredibly perfect the lie was. My engineering mind instantly analyzed the structure of their story, and I realized it was a masterpiece of manipulation. 2 years ago, Patricia had indeed gone through a very dark period. She suffered from severe insomnia. She would pace the house at all hours of the night. She was depressed, distant, and she spent hours alone in the home office staring at the computer screen. I had thought she was just going through a difficult hormonal transition or seasonal depression. The lie fit those symptoms flawlessly. Anyone looking at her behavior from the outside would easily believe she was hiding a dark, consuming addiction. They had weaponized her mental health struggles against her memory. They had taken her pain and used it as the foundation for their alibi. I looked at Derek's tear-stained face. I looked at Sarah's comforting, gentle posture. They were standing in my kitchen, drinking my coffee, calmly assassinating the character of the mother they had just buried yesterday. They thought I was a senile, trusting fool. They thought the context of Patricia's past depression would blind me to the truth. And for a fleeting second, the lie was so plausible, so well constructed, that a weaker man would have believed it and thanked them for their sacrifice. I pulled my hand out from under Derek's grasp. I reached up and wiped a fake tear from my own eye. I nodded slowly, letting out a heavy, defeated sigh. I told them I was overwhelmed. I told them I needed to lie down and process this heartbreaking revelation. I thanked them for carrying such a heavy burden to protect me. They hugged me, completely convinced they had won. But as they walked out the front door, I knew the war had just begun. I walked them to the front entryway, my shoulders deliberately slumped to sell the performance. I reached out and pulled Derek into a tight embrace. I told him how proud I was of him for stepping up, for protecting his mother's dignity during this incredibly painful time. Sarah wrapped her arms around my waist, resting her head against my chest, just like she used to when she was a little girl afraid of the dark. I kissed the top of her head. In that exact moment, Despite everything I had seen in that cold storage unit, a strange, overwhelming wave of relief washed over me. The human mind is a fragile thing when it is drowning in grief. It looks for any floating piece of debris to cling to. As I held my children, a part of my broken heart desperately wanted to believe their perfectly crafted lie. I wanted to believe that Patricia was just a flawed woman who made terrible mistakes in the dark hours of her depression. I wanted to believe that the $2 million and the forged signatures were just desperate, panicking attempts to pay off ruthless creditors. It was a painful, ugly truth, but it was so much easier to swallow than the terrifying alternative. If they were telling the truth, then my children were heroes. They were trying to save our family from financial ruin. They were carrying the weight of their mother's sins so I would not have to suffer the embarrassment. I closed my eyes and let myself sink into that comforting illusion, ready to accept this tragedy and move forward. They finally pulled away, offering me gentle, reassuring smiles that seemed so incredibly genuine. Derek told me to get some rest, promising he would handle all the necessary paperwork with the bank so I would not have to stress about it. Sarah squeezed my hand one last time before they stepped out onto the front porch. I closed the heavy oak door behind them, the click of the lock echoing loudly in the silent house. I stood there in the foyer for a long time, listening to the muffled sound of their footsteps descending the brick stairs. The exhaustion was pulling heavily at my bones, urging me to go upstairs, crawl into my empty bed, and just sleep for days. My mind was incredibly heavy with the immense burden of my wife's supposed secret life. I felt a profound sense of sadness, but also a deep appreciation for the two wonderful children I had raised to be so responsible. But a nagging, restless energy kept me rooted firmly to the floor. I walked slowly into the living room and approached the large bay window that overlooked the manicured front yard. I reached out and parted the heavy wooden blinds just a fraction of an inch, peering out into the bright morning sunlight. I just wanted to watch them leave. I wanted to see my children walking side by side, united in their effort to protect our family legacy. I watched them stroll down the long concrete driveway, chatting quietly together, the tension completely gone from their posture. Then I heard the distinct, aggressive roar of a high-performance engine turning onto our quiet suburban street. A vehicle pulled up to the curb, parking right at the end of my driveway. It was not Derek's sensible company sedan. It was a brand-new, pristine white Porsche Cayenne Turbo. The morning sun gleamed beautifully off the flawless paint and the massive custom black alloy wheels. The tinted passenger window rolled down smoothly, revealing Derek's wife, Megan, sitting proudly behind the leather-wrapped steering wheel. She was wearing a pair of oversized designer sunglasses and smiling brightly at her husband. Derek opened the passenger door, sliding comfortably into the luxurious cabin, while Sarah climbed into the spacious back seat. I stared at the vehicle, my breath suddenly catching in my throat. I know cars. I know engineering, and I know the exact cost of luxury automotive upgrades. That specific model with those custom interior packages easily cost over $150,000. It still had the temporary dealer tags taped to the inside of the rear windshield. They had just bought it. The dealership name was printed boldly across the paper license plate in the back window. I stood perfectly still, my fingers gripping the edges of the wooden blinds so tightly my knuckles began to ache. The comforting illusion I had just wrapped myself in evaporated entirely into the cold morning air. My analytical engineer brain clicked into high gear, processing the raw data right in front of my eyes. The mathematics of their story simply did not add up. You do not buy a $150,000 luxury supercar when you are supposedly drowning in your deceased mother's secret online gambling debt. You do not finance a brand new luxury Porsche when you are desperately taking out secret loans to save your childhood family home from imminent foreclosure. People who are financially ruined do not act like lottery winners on a shopping spree. The lie crumbled, entirely collapsing under the heavy weight of its own arrogant greed. They were not paying off Patricia's debts at all. They were spending my hard-earned life savings. They were celebrating my absolute destruction. I watched the sleek white sport utility vehicle accelerate rapidly down the street, disappearing quickly around the corner, and the very last shred of my paternal denial vanished with it. My children were not protecting me. They were acting like parasites feeding on a dying host. And whatever Patricia had been secretly investigating, before she died, it clearly had absolutely nothing to do with gambling. I let the wooden blinds snap shut, turning my back to the bright window. It was time to stop weeping, wipe my eyes, and start digging for the real truth. I walked away from the living room window, my boots heavy on the hardwood floor, and headed straight for the basement door. The air down there was damp and smelled faintly of old cardboard and copper pipes. Tucked away in the far corner behind my heavy workbench and a stack of plastic storage bins sat the central hub of our home security system. 3 years ago, a massive lightning strike hit the transformer at the end of our street. It blew out half the electronics in the neighborhood, including the interface of my security panel upstairs. Derek had come over the next day to help me assess the damage. He took one look at the fried keypad and confidently declared the entire system completely dead. I never bothered to correct him. I am a structural engineer. I build in redundancies. The keypad was dead, but the heavy-duty recording server wired into an independent backup battery deep in the basement was perfectly fine. I just never told anyone because I thought I would never need it. We lived in a quiet, safe suburb. I kept the cameras running out of pure habit, recording over the hard drive every 90 days. I pulled the rolling chair out from under my workbench and sat down in front of the dusty monitor. I pressed the power button on the tower. The machine hummed to life a low, steady vibration that felt like a heartbeat in the silent basement. I typed in my password and brought up the main directory. The interface was clunky and outdated, but the data was safely there. I did the math in my head. Derek and Sarah claimed Patricia started gambling heavily 2 years ago, but the massive drain on the retirement accounts really accelerated about 3 months ago. That was when Patricia became truly distant, locking herself in the house, refusing to go to her gardening club and pacing the floors at night. I selected the camera feed for the kitchen and dialed the calendar back exactly 3 months to a Tuesday night. I sat there in the dim light of the basement, my eyes locked on the screen, scrolling through hours of fast-forwarded footage. Days passed in seconds. I watched Patricia making coffee. I watched myself reading the newspaper. Then I slowed the playback down to normal speed when the timestamp hit late evening. It was a Thursday night, 11:30. I was out of town at a consulting conference in Denver. The kitchen was dark, illuminated only by the small light above the stove. Patricia walked into the frame. She was wearing her thick flannel robe, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. She looked exhausted. But she did not go to the refrigerator for a glass of water, and she did not open a laptop to log into an illegal offshore poker site. Instead, she walked over to the back door, unlocked the heavy deadbolt, and slowly opened it. A man stepped out of the shadows and into my kitchen. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a cheap, wrinkled trench coat that looked completely out of place in our pristine neighborhood. I paused the video, leaning closer to the monitor, my nose almost touching the cold glass. I enhanced the image, zooming in on the stranger's chest. Clipped to his belt, just barely visible when his coat fell open, was a metallic badge. It was not a police shield. It was a private investigator credential. I hit play again. Patricia gestured for the man to sit at the kitchen island. She did not offer him a drink. Her body language was rigid, defensive, and deeply frightened. The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick manila folder, sliding it across the marble countertop. Patricia opened it. Even on the grainy security footage, I could see her hands shaking violently. She stared at the documents inside the folder for a long time. Then she reached into the deep pocket of her robe and pulled out a thick white envelope. It was bulging with cash. She handed it to the investigator. He nodded, stood up, and quietly let himself out the back door. Patricia sat alone in the dark kitchen for another hour, clutching that manila folder tightly to her chest, sobbing silently into her hands. I sat back in my chair, the cold basement air suddenly feeling absolutely suffocating. My wife was not a gambler. She had not lost our life savings on internet poker games. She was paying a private investigator in untraceable cash to dig up information. The pieces of this twisted puzzle were slowly sliding into place, but the picture they were forming was horrifying. Patricia had found out that the money was disappearing. She had seen the forged signatures and the reverse mortgage on our home. But instead of coming to me, instead of calling the police, she hired a professional to quietly investigate the massive theft. Why would she do that? Why would my gentle, loving wife bypass law enforcement and risk her own safety to conduct a shadow investigation? There was only one conclusion. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train, knocking the breath out of my lungs. You only hide an investigation from the police if you are trying to protect the person committing the terrible crime. She knew who was stealing from us. She knew it was someone incredibly close, someone she loved too much to send to a concrete prison cell without trying to fix it herself first. She was investigating our own children. But what on earth did that private investigator find in that manila folder that was so unbelievably dangerous, so terrifying, that it ultimately ended up costing my wife her life? I had to find out. I had to know exactly what was inside that folder before my children realized I was hunting them. The clock was ticking, and I was out of time. The week that followed was an exercise in pure psychological endurance. I played the part of the broken morning husband, perfectly shuffling around the house in my slippers and answering their phone calls with a frail, shaking voice. Exactly 1 week after the funeral, I invited Derek and Sarah over for a family dinner. I told them I wanted to thank them for being such supportive children during the hardest chapter of my life. I spent the entire afternoon cooking a heavy pot roast, the way Patricia used to make it, letting the rich aroma of beef and rosemary fill the empty house. I set the large mahogany dining table with our best china. When the doorbell finally rang at 6 o'clock, I took a deep breath, plastered a weak smile onto my face, and opened the door. Derek and Sarah were standing on the porch, but they were not alone. Standing right behind them was a tall, sharply dressed man carrying a sleek leather briefcase. Derek introduced him smoothly as an old college friend who just happened to be in the neighborhood, but the cold, calculating look in the man's eyes told an entirely different story. I welcomed them inside, playing the role of the gracious, confused host. We sat down at the dining table, the heavy silence punctuated only by the clinking of silverware against porcelain. The small talk did not last long. Before I could even finish my first slice of roast, Derek cleared his throat and set his fork down. He looked at Sarah, who immediately reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick stack of legal papers. The stranger opened his briefcase and produced a high-end fountain pen, placing it deliberately on the polished wood table. Derek leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, adopting that same practiced, sympathetic tone he had used in my kitchen a week prior. He said they had been talking, and they were deeply worried about my mental state. He told me that losing Patricia had taken a visible toll on my cognitive abilities. Sarah chimed in gently, placing a hand over mine. She said I was looking frail, that I was forgetting things, and that the stress of managing the house and the finances was too much for a grieving widower to handle. She slid the stack of papers across the table toward me. It was a comprehensive, ironclad power of attorney agreement. It was designed to hand over absolute legal control of my entire life, my remaining assets, and my home directly to my son and daughter. The stranger spoke, introducing himself as a wealth management attorney, offering to walk me through the signatures to make the transition as painless as possible. I sat perfectly still in my chair, staring down at the thick black ink on the legal documents. I looked up slowly, shifting my gaze from the cold lawyer to my daughter, and finally to my son. I looked deeply into their eyes, searching for any lingering trace of the innocent children I had raised. There was absolutely nothing there but pure, unadulterated greed. They were looking at me not as a father, but as an obstacle to be managed, a decaying asset to be liquidated. My chest tightened with a profound, suffocating sorrow. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent on freezing construction sites, breathing in toxic cement dust until my lungs burned. I remembered working grueling 80-hour weeks, missing holidays and birthdays, all to pay the exorbitant tuition fees for their Ivy League educations. I had broken my own body to ensure they would never have to experience the bitter taste of poverty. I built a fortress of financial security around them, and now they were using the very education I paid for to legally strip me of my dignity and my home. They were using my manufactured grief as a weapon to declare me incompetent. They wanted me out of the way so they could finish draining whatever was left of my life savings to pay off their own twisted debts. I knew I had to play along. I knew that if I refused to sign, if I showed them the anger boiling beneath my skin, they would realize I was onto them. They would panic, and they would hide the rest of their tracks. I needed to maintain the illusion of absolute surrender. I let out a long, shaky sigh, allowing my shoulders to sag forward in defeat. I looked at Derek with watery, trusting eyes and told him that he was probably right. I told him I was just so tired and that I trusted them to do what was best for the family. A sickening smile of victory briefly flashed across Derek's face before he quickly hid it behind a mask of solemn duty. Sarah visibly relaxed, letting out a breath she had been holding. The lawyer picked up the heavy fountain pen and extended it across the table toward my right hand. I reached out slowly, my fingers trembling on command, acting like a man submitting to his final fate. I asked them to point to exactly where I needed to sign. But just as my fingers brushed against the cool metal barrel of the pen, I felt a sharp vibration against my thigh. My phone, tucked safely in the pocket of my slacks beneath the table, buzzed aggressively. It was not a phone call. It was a single, distinct vibration. A text message. I paused, keeping my hand hovering over the legal document. I politely excused myself, murmuring that I needed to check my blood sugar alarm. I pulled the heavy phone out from under the table and tapped the dark glass screen. The bright notification illuminated my lap. It was another automated scheduled text message from my dead wife's phone number. The message contained only 7 words. Check my heart meds. Look in drawer number 3. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs. The lawyer was still holding the fountain pen out to me, his cold eyes waiting for my signature. Derek and Sarah were watching my face with an unsettling intensity. I forced my hand to tremble a little more violently, pulling it back from the pen. I let out a ragged breath and mumbled an apology. I told them my stomach was suddenly acting up, perhaps from the stress of the evening, and I just needed a quick moment in the bathroom before I could focus on such important legal documents. Derek nodded graciously, waving a hand and telling me to take all the time I needed. I pushed my chair back from the heavy mahogany table. My legs felt like they were made of liquid lead, but I forced myself to stand and walk slowly toward the hallway. I could feel their eyes burning into my back as I shuffled away. As soon as I turned the corner and was out of their line of sight, my posture instantly straightened. The facade of the frail old man vanished. I hurried down the carpeted hallway and slipped into the master bathroom, closing the heavy wooden door behind me. I turned the brass lock until it clicked softly, securing myself inside. I leaned back against the door, closing my eyes and forcing my breathing to steady. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of their voices drifting down the hall from the dining room. They were probably whispering to the lawyer, celebrating their impending victory. I opened my eyes and looked at the large vanity mirror. My reflection stared back at me, pale and exhausted, but my eyes were sharp. I stepped over to Patricia's side of the vanity. Since the day she died, I had not touched a single thing on her counter. Her favorite perfume bottle was still sitting next to her silver hairbrush. I took a deep breath, inhaling the faint scent of vanilla that still lingered in the room, and then I opened the cabinet beneath her sink. Inside, there were several small sliding drawers where she organized her cosmetics and daily necessities. The text message had been incredibly specific. Drawer number 3. I counted down from the top. 1, 2, 3. I pulled the small plastic drawer open. It was not filled with makeup or skincare products. Sitting alone in the center of the tray was a single translucent amber prescription bottle with a white child-proof cap. I reached out and picked it up. My calloused fingers traced the familiar paper label. It was her standard beta blocker, a medication she had been taking for the better part of a decade to manage her mild hypertension and keep her resting heart rate under control. The instructions printed on the label were clear. Take 1 tablet daily. I remembered the night she died. She had been restless, pacing the house, clutching her chest, before collapsing onto the living room rug. The paramedics had called it a massive, sudden myocardial infarction, a catastrophic heart attack. They said her heart had just given out under the strain of her age and stress. I had accepted their medical conclusion because it made perfect sense at the time. I gripped the white plastic cap pressed down firmly and twisted it until it popped open. I tilted the bottle and poured a few of the small tablets into the palm of my hand. I held them up to the bright vanity lights, squinting as my engineering mind analyzed their physical properties. Something was wrong. For years, I had watched Patricia take her medication every single morning with her coffee. Her beta blockers were perfectly round, chalky white pills with a distinct score mark down the center. But the pills sitting in my hand right now were subtly different. They were white, yes, but they had a very faint, almost imperceptible pale blue tint to them, and their shape was slightly more oval. A normal person, a grieving husband, would never have noticed the difference. But I was a man who had spent 40 years inspecting microscopic stress fractures in load-bearing steel. My entire career was built on noticing the tiny invisible anomalies that others missed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. A few years ago, my doctor had me download a medical application designed to identify loose pills and manage prescriptions just in case I ever mixed up my own daily vitamins. I opened the application, my thumb hovering over the search bar. I looked closely at the tiny alphanumeric code stamped into the surface of the pale blue oval pill in my hand. I carefully typed the letters and numbers into the search field and pressed enter. A loading circle spun on the bright screen for 2 agonizing seconds. Then the database results populated. I stared at the screen, the blood draining completely from my face. The medication in my hand was not a beta blocker. It was not designed to lower blood pressure or protect a fragile heart. The application identified the pill as a maximum-strength, pure amphetamine salt. It was a severe, high-dose stimulant, typically prescribed for profound neurological disorders and known to drastically accelerate the human heart rate. The medical reality of what I was looking at slammed into my chest like a physical weight. If a 68-year-old woman with a documented history of hypertension and a weakened cardiovascular system ingested this stimulant, it would send her heart into immediate catastrophic overdrive. It would trigger a massive fatal cardiac arrest within an hour. And it would look exactly like a natural tragedy to any paramedic rushing into the chaotic scene. The pill bottle had been deliberately swapped. My wife did not die of natural causes. She was brutally and systematically murdered. And the murderers are sitting in my dining room now eating my food. I flushed the toilet to sell the lie, dropped the small amber bottle of amphetamines into my trouser pocket, and splashed cold water on my face. I gripped the edges of the porcelain sink, staring at my reflection. The frail, weeping old man was gone. I dried my face with a clean towel, unlocked the bathroom door, and walked back down the hallway. When I entered the dining room, Derek and Sarah were quietly whispering with the lawyer. They immediately stopped when they saw me. I hunched my shoulders, pressing a hand to my stomach, and told them I was sorry, but I was ill. I said I needed to lie down and asked if we could finish the paperwork tomorrow. The lawyer looked irritated, but Derek quickly agreed. He told me to rest, leaving the stack of documents on the mahogany table so I could review them in the morning. I walked them to the door, offering apologies. As soon as the deadbolt slid into place behind them, I stood up straight. The tremors in my hands vanished. My blood was no longer running cold with grief. It was boiling with focused rage. I walked to my home office and picked up the telephone. It was time to stop playing defense. I dialed a number I had not called in 5 years. It belonged to Mitchell Pierce. Mitchell and I went way back to my early days in commercial construction. While I was analyzing the physical structure of skyscrapers, Mitchell was analyzing the financial structures of the corporations building them. He was a forensic accountant and the most ruthless, relentless financial investigator in the city of Chicago. He was the kind of man who could find a single missing dollar hidden in a labyrinth of 1,000 shell companies. I did not bother with pleasantries when he answered the phone. I told him my wife had been murdered, my life savings were stolen, and my own children were holding the smoking gun. Mitchell was silent for 3 heavy seconds. Then he asked where I needed him to be. I gave him the address to the storage facility in Aurora and told him to meet me there in 1 hour. I grabbed the canvas duffel bag filled with Patricia's legal binders, locked my house securely, and drove back out into the dark night. When I pulled up to Unit 11, Mitchell was already waiting in his black sedan. He stepped out into the chill air, a tall, imposing figure carrying 2 heavy metal briefcases of his own equipment. We rolled up the orange metal door and stepped into the glowing, humming nerve center my wife had built. Mitchell let out a low whistle as he took in the stacked computer servers and the industrial paper shredder. He set his briefcases on the steel desk, flipped open his laptops, and immediately went to work. I pulled the heavy binders out of my duffel bag and laid them flat on the table, showing him the forged wire transfers and the maxed-out reverse mortgage on my house. For the next 4 hours, the storage unit was dead silent, except for the frantic clicking of Mitchell's keyboard and the low hum of the cooling units. I paced the concrete floor, my mind racing through the horrific reality of my situation. I was officially at war. But this was not a battlefield with guns and trenches. This was a war of legal contracts, offshore accounts, and psychological manipulation. My enemies were the people whose diapers I had changed the children I had taught to ride bicycles. They had the advantage of youth, the element of surprise, and an absolute lack of moral conscience. But I had something they severely underestimated. I had patience, I had 40 years of structural problem-solving experience, and I now had Mitchell Pierce. Mitchell began tracing the digital footprint of the stolen money. He bypassed the surface-level banking information and dug directly into the routing numbers Patricia had painstakingly collected. He explained that whoever set this up was incredibly sophisticated, bouncing the funds through multiple anonymous accounts in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus to wash the trail clean. But Patricia had managed to capture the final destination of the massive wire transfers before she was killed. Mitchell tapped his fingers against the desk, his eyes darting across the scrolling lines of code and financial records illuminating his screen. He was following the breadcrumbs my brave wife had left behind. Suddenly, Mitchell stopped typing. He leaned closer to his monitor, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He opened a new window, typing furiously to access a restricted state business registry. The bright blue light from the screen reflected in his eyes as he read the results. He slowly took off his reading glasses and let out a heavy, troubled breath. He turned his chair around to face me, his expression darker and more serious than I had ever seen it. I asked him what he found. I asked him if he had located the $2 million Derek and Sarah had stolen from my retirement portfolio. Mitchell shook his head slowly. He told me the money was gone. But that was not the worst part. He looked me in the eye and said he had just run a deep background check on my son's real estate firm, the company Derek constantly bragged about with the flashy downtown office and luxury cars. Mitchell revealed that Derek's firm had not actually closed a single legitimate property deal in over 3 years. The entire business was completely bankrupt on paper. But millions of dollars were still flowing into its corporate accounts every single month from unknown, untraceable sources. Mitchell tossed a printed ledger onto the steel desk. He said Derek was not a real estate developer anymore. The company was nothing but a massive, highly illegal front for a shadow banking syndicate, and my son was in business with incredibly dangerous people. The drive back from the storage unit in Aurora felt entirely different from the drive there. The crushing weight of grief had been completely replaced by a cold and calculated clarity. Mitchell's revelation echoed in my mind as the highway lines blurred past my windshield. My son was not just a greedy child stealing from his father. He was a desperate man backed into a corner by incredibly dangerous people. A shadow banking syndicate does not accept apologies, and they certainly do not forgive massive debts. Derek had leveraged my home and drained my life savings because his own life was likely on the line. And Patricia had discovered the truth. She had built that war room to expose him, hoping the authorities could protect him from the syndicate before they killed him. Instead, Sarah had protected her brother, the only way she knew how. She had murdered our mother. I pulled into my driveway as the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale gray light over the quiet suburban street. I walked into the house, my boots echoing in the empty foyer. The stack of legal documents was still sitting exactly where the lawyer had left them on the mahogany dining table. I walked over and stared down at the crisp white pages. A power of attorney. The ultimate surrender of my life, my assets, and my freedom. They wanted the legal authority to liquidate everything I had left to save Derek from the monsters he was in bed with. I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to give them exactly what they wanted, or at least exactly what they thought they wanted. I had to build a Trojan horse. At 9 o'clock in the morning, I picked up the telephone and called Derek. I kept my voice weak, letting a slight tremor bleed into my words. I told him I had spent the night thinking about his offer. I told him I was just too exhausted to manage the house and the accounts anymore. I asked him to come over with Sarah so we could finalize the paperwork. They arrived less than 30 minutes later. They practically ran up the front steps, their faces poorly masking their absolute elation. Sarah immediately went to the kitchen to make a pot of tea, playing the role of the caring daughter, while Derek sat down across from me at the dining table. He slid the documents toward me, handing me a sleek black pen. I took a deep breath, letting my hands shake visibly as I picked up the pen. I looked at Derek, offering a sad, defeated smile. Then I pressed the tip of the pen to the signature line. For 40 years, I drafted structural blueprints that required absolute millimeter precision. I know exactly how to draw a line, and I know exactly how to alter one. I began to write my name, but I completely changed the angle of my customary loops. I applied heavy pressure where I normally used a light touch. And most importantly, I inserted a middle initial, Richard Thomas Caldwell. But my middle name is Edward. I have never used a letter T in any legal document in my entire life. In the state of Illinois, a contested power of attorney with a mismatched middle initial and a visibly altered stroke pattern is entirely legally void. It is a completely worthless piece of paper. I slid the signed documents back across the table. Derek snatched them up almost immediately. His eyes scanned the ink, but he only saw what he desperately wanted to see. He saw his ultimate salvation. He saw access to the remaining equity in my home. He smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze my shoulder. He told me I made the right choice and that he would take care of absolutely everything from now on. I looked down at my hands resting quietly on the table. I told them that since everything was finally settled, I needed some time completely to myself. I explained that a friend from my old engineering firm had offered me the use of his private hunting cabin in the deep woods of Montana. I told them it was completely off the grid. No internet access. No telephone lines. Absolutely zero cellular service. I said I was going to pack a bag and drive out there for the next 2 weeks to fish, walk in the woods, and try to heal from the sudden loss of their mother. I asked them not to worry if they could not reach me. Sarah walked into the dining room carrying 2 mugs of hot tea. She set them down and hugged me tightly from behind. She said it sounded like a wonderful healing idea. She told me to take all the time I needed and promised they would keep a close eye on the house while I was gone. Of course they would. A 2-week absence with zero communication was a dream come true for them. It gave them 14 uninterrupted days to raid my remaining accounts, finalize the liquidation of the estate, and clean up any lingering evidence of their crimes. An hour later, I packed a heavy canvas duffel bag with enough clothes and provisions to last me several weeks. I carried it out to my truck, tossed it into the passenger seat, and locked the front door of my house. Derek and Sarah stood on the front lawn waving goodbye like perfect, loving children, sending their elderly father off on a relaxing vacation. I started the engine, offered one final wave, and drove down the street. But I did not drive toward the interstate. I did not head for the airport or the long highway leading to Montana. I drove exactly 3 blocks away, turned down a narrow alleyway, and parked my truck behind a decaying commercial strip mall. I grabbed my duffel bag and walked quietly back through the neighborhood, staying entirely out of sight. I approached a shabby 2-story apartment building located directly across the street from my own property. Earlier that morning, while they were eagerly rushing over to get my forged signature, I had called the landlord of this building and paid 2 months of rent in untraceable cash for a vacant unit on the 2nd floor. I unlocked the wooden door of the apartment and stepped inside. The room smelled of old cigarettes and damp carpet. I walked straight to the front window and carefully parted the dusty, yellowed blinds. From this vantage point, I had an unobstructed, perfect view of my front door, my driveway, and my living room windows. I set my bag on the floor and pulled a pair of high-powered binoculars from my coat. I was not going to Montana to heal. I was staying right here in the shadows to watch the vultures descend on my home. I lowered the heavy binoculars and walked over to the cheap folding table I had set up in the center of the dark living room. I unzipped my canvas duffel bag and carefully pulled out a high-capacity laptop and a portable wireless router. My children thought I was a helpless old man who could barely operate a remote, but they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my profession. A structural engineer does not just look at the painted surface of a building. We understand the complex skeleton beneath the drywall. We know exactly how the electrical veins and plumbing arteries flow through the hidden spaces of a structure. Over the past 3 nights, while Derek and Sarah thought I was weeping myself to sleep in my empty bed, I had been systematically dissecting my own house. I had purchased a dozen high-definition micro cameras from a specialized security supplier, the kind that are practically invisible to the naked eye. But I did not rely on the cheap lithium batteries they came packaged with. Batteries eventually die, and I needed an uninterrupted permanent video feed that would never fail me. I waited until the early hours of the morning, when the neighborhood was dead quiet, to do my secret work. I unscrewed the smoke detectors in the hallways, the living room, the basement, and the master bedroom. I bored tiny millimeter-wide holes into the white plastic casings to perfectly conceal the microscopic camera lenses. Then, drawing on 4 decades of hands-on experience working with commercial electrical grids, I meticulously spliced the tiny power wires of the cameras directly into the main electrical lines of the house. I bypassed the standard circuit breakers entirely. Even if Derek tried to flip the main switches in the basement to work in the dark, the cameras were wired to draw residual power directly from the heavy-duty backup generator outside. I hid another high-resolution lens perfectly inside the ornate wooden frame of the large family portrait hanging directly above the fireplace mantel. The bitter irony was certainly not lost on me. I was hiding the ultimate tool of their destruction right behind a smiling framed photograph of the very family they had so violently destroyed. By the time the sun came up each morning, there was absolutely no visible trace of my midnight renovations. There was no drywall dust left on the hardwood floors, no crooked picture frames, and no out-of-place wires. My home had secretly become a living, breathing surveillance network, and every single room was now wired to broadcast a secure, heavily encrypted signal directly to the cloud server I had rented. I plugged the sleek laptop into the wall outlet of the shabby apartment and booted up the operating system. The screen glowed brightly in the dim, stale room, casting a pale blue light across my worn face. I typed in the complex alphanumeric encryption key I had generated, my calloused fingers moving quickly and deliberately across the keyboard. A green loading bar appeared on the screen, filling slowly, as the software reached digitally across the street and connected to the hidden network inside my home. My heart beat with a steady, calculated rhythm. There was absolutely no fear left in my chest, only a cold, mechanical anticipation of the justice I was about to serve. I knew that what I was doing crossed several legal boundaries regarding privacy, but the laws of men meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. I was seeking a higher form of retribution for the innocent woman who had shared my life. The software chimed softly in the quiet room, and the dark computer screen suddenly fractured into a perfect grid of 12 high-definition video feeds. I could see everything. I saw my empty kitchen with the gleaming marble countertops. I saw the heavy mahogany dining table where the forged legal papers still lay perfectly undisturbed. I had clear views of the long hallways, the dark concrete basement, and the master bedroom where my wife had spent her final terrified nights. The audio feeds were crystal clear, picking up the faint rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing in the front foyer. I adjusted the digital contrast on the screens, making sure every dark corner and shadow in the house was perfectly illuminated and visible. I pulled up a dilapidated wooden chair, its uneven legs scraping loudly against the bare floorboards of the apartment, and sat down directly in front of the glowing video grid. I reached into my deep coat pocket and pulled out the small amber prescription bottle of lethal amphetamines. I set it down gently on the plastic table right next to the laptop keyboard. It sat there as a silent, glaring reminder of exactly why I was putting myself through this agonizing nightmare. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest and stared intensely at the empty rooms of the house I had spent 30 long years paying for. The house where I had raised a murderer and a ruthless thief. The trap was now perfectly set. The bait was the forged power of attorney document sitting on the dining table, promising them the golden keys to their ill-gotten financial kingdom. They thought I was driving my truck down a lonely highway toward the distant mountains of Montana, completely oblivious to their twisted, murderous schemes. They truly believed the house was entirely theirs to plunder without consequence. The silence in the cheap apartment was absolutely deafening, broken only by the low, steady humming of the powerful laptop fan trying to keep the internal processors completely cool. Every single passing minute felt exactly like an agonizing eternity. I did not blink. I did not move a single muscle in my tired body. I leaned forward in the uncomfortable wooden chair, my eyes locked unblinking on the front door camera feed, just breathing slowly as I waited for the monsters to finally arrive at my doorstep. I did not have to wait very long. Barely 2 hours had passed since I pulled out of my own driveway, when the familiar roar of a high-performance engine echoed through the quiet street. The sleek white luxury sport utility vehicle pulled smoothly up to the curb, parking directly in front of my house. The doors opened, and 4 people stepped out. Derek, Sarah, Megan, and Brian. They did not look like a family in mourning. They looked like tourists arriving at a luxury resort, walking with brisk energy. Derek unlocked the front door. He pushed it open and they flooded into the foyer. From my digital vantage point across the street, I watched them enter through the high-definition camera hidden inside the antique grandfather clock. The moment the heavy front door clicked shut behind them, any lingering pretense of sorrow instantly vanished. Derek let out a loud, triumphant cheer that echoed off the hardwood floors. He grabbed his wife Megan by the waist and spun her around in a circle. Sarah laughed out loud, a sharp grating sound that I had not heard in weeks, while Brian trailed behind them carrying a heavy canvas bag that clinked with the distinct sound of metal tools. They moved into the kitchen, perfectly tracked by the camera I had wired into the smoke detector above the marble island. Derek walked straight to the custom wine refrigerator I had installed for Patricia. He pulled out a bottle of vintage champagne, a bottle I had been saving for our 50th wedding anniversary. He grabbed 4 crystal flutes from the overhead cabinet and popped the cork. The loud crack resonated through the audio feed. They raised their flutes in the center of the kitchen. Derek made a toast. He smiled widely and raised his glass to the clueless old man. He joked about how incredibly easy it was to break me mimicking my shaking hands and frail voice from the dining room table. He said I handed over the keys to the kingdom without putting up a single fight. Sarah clinked her glass against his, adding that it was pathetic how eager I was to run away and hide in the woods. They threw their heads back and drank my anniversary champagne, celebrating my destruction, in the very room where my wife used to bake for them. I sat in the dark, suffocating apartment, my hands balled into tight fists, resting on my knees. I watched the people I had created, the people I had bled for, act like ravenous scavengers picking the meat off a fresh carcass. After they finished their drinks, the celebratory mood shifted into aggressive, calculated action. Derek set his empty glass on the marble counter and gestured toward the back hallway. He told Brian to bring the bag. I switched the primary monitor feed to the home office. This was my private sanctuary, the room where I kept my engineering blueprints, my tax documents, and a heavy steel wall safe hidden cleverly behind a large bookshelf. Derek and Brian walked into the room, followed closely by Sarah and Megan. Derek did not bother looking for the combination written down somewhere, nor did he ask me for it before I supposedly left for Montana. He just pointed at the bookshelf. Brian unzipped the heavy canvas bag and pulled out a massive solid steel crowbar. They shoved the heavy oak bookshelf out of the way, scratching the polished hardwood floor I had meticulously installed with my own hands. Brian wedged the flat end of the crowbar into the narrow seam of the wall safe. He grunted, throwing his entire body weight against the heavy iron tool. The metal groaned and shrieked as the reinforced steel door began to buckle under the immense pressure. Derek stepped in to help, placing his hands over Brian's, and together they pushed with all their might. The drywall around the safe cracked and crumbled, raining white dust down onto the carpet. With a loud, violent snap, the locking mechanism finally gave way. The heavy steel door swung open, revealing the velvet-lined interior. They began pulling out my most private possessions. Envelopes of emergency cash, my antique coin collection, and a small velvet box containing the pearl necklace I had bought for Patricia on our first anniversary. Megan eagerly grabbed the necklace, holding it up to the light and admiring the pearls against her skin before slipping it casually into her designer purse. They were not just taking my financial assets. They were violently erasing my history, stealing the precious memories of a life they had already destroyed. I watched them empty the safe, tossing discarded papers onto the floor. Derek grabbed a thick stack of bearer bonds and fanned them out like a deck of playing cards, a greedy smirk plastered across his face. But then the audio feed picked up a sudden shift in the conversation. The laughter died down, replaced by a cold, serious tone. Sarah leaned against my mahogany desk, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked directly at her brother, her eyes narrowing as she lowered her voice. The microphone hidden in the ceiling caught her words with terrifying clarity. She asked Derek if the insurance agent had finally confirmed the policy. Derek stopped fanning the bonds. He nodded very slowly. He confirmed that the $5 million life insurance policy had been fully approved and activated the day before. The room went silent. Sarah looked at the floor, biting her lower lip, before looking back up at her brother. She asked how they were going to handle the gas line without making it look suspicious. My blood turned to ice. The champagne, the broken safe, the stolen jewelry, all of it was just the terrifying beginning of their ultimate plan. They were not waiting for me to die of natural causes in a nursing home. They were actively plotting to end my life and take everything else. I sat completely paralyzed in the dimly lit apartment, staring at the glowing monitors as the chilling reality of their words washed over me. A gas line. They were planning to tamper with the natural gas pipes in my basement, turning the home I built into a massive, highly combustible bomb. If I had actually gone to Montana, or if I had stayed in my own bed tonight, I would have been completely obliterated. I watched Sarah point toward the basement door, discussing the layout of the ventilation shafts with her brother, like they were casually planning a kitchen remodel. Megan was still admiring my dead wife's pearls, entirely indifferent to the murder being orchestrated right in front of her. Brian just stood by the ruined wall safe, nodding his head in quiet agreement. I felt a sudden violent wave of nausea wash over my entire body. I had spent 40 years designing structures to protect human life, and now my own flesh and blood were reverse engineering my life's work to orchestrate my execution. Suddenly, the harsh vibration of my cell phone shattered the dead silence of the apartment. I jumped in my wooden chair, my heart leaping into my throat. I pulled the phone from my pocket, terrified that the noise might somehow transmit through the cameras, even though I knew the audio was strictly a one-way feed. The caller identification displayed Mitchell Pierce's name. I swiped the screen to answer and pressed the phone tightly to my ear, my eyes never leaving the video grid showing my children in the living room. Before I could even speak a single word, Mitchell's voice blasted through the speaker. He was breathing heavily, and the usual cold, calculated tone of the forensic accountant was completely gone. He sounded genuinely terrified. "Richard, you need to listen to me right now." Mitchell said, his words rushing out in a frantic, breathless cadence. "I have been digging through the financial back channels all morning, trying to trace the money Derek owes to the shadow banking syndicate. But the numbers were not making any sense. A $4 million debt does not just disappear with a maxed-out reverse mortgage. They needed a massive lump sum payout to clear the ledger and walk away clean. So I started looking elsewhere. I decided to look closely at your daughter." I kept my eyes on the monitor. Sarah was now walking toward the basement stairs, turning on the overhead lights. I asked Mitchell what he had found, keeping my voice down to a harsh whisper in the empty room. Mitchell took a deep breath. He told me he had used a backdoor program to bypass the security firewalls of the city hospital, where Sarah worked as an administrative director. He wanted to see if she was embezzling from the hospital to help cover her brother's massive debts. But he did not find missing hospital funds. Instead, he found Patricia's medical records. He found the autopsy files. Richard Sarah used her top-level administrative clearance to access the morgue database the morning after Patricia died. Mitchell explained, his voice trembling slightly. "I found the original unedited toxicology report. The one the medical examiner filed before your daughter got her hands on the digital system. Patricia did not suffer a natural heart attack. Her bloodstream was absolutely saturated with a lethal dose of maximum-strength amphetamines." I closed my eyes, a single hot tear escaping and rolling down my cheek. I reached into my coat pocket with my free hand, my fingers wrapping tightly around the amber prescription bottle I had taken from the master bathroom. I told Mitchell I already knew. I told him I found the swapped pills hidden in her vanity drawer. There was a brief moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Mitchell swallowed hard, the sound clearly audible over the phone. Then his voice dropped an entire octave, becoming deadly serious. "If you already know they murdered your wife, then you need to understand exactly what they are planning for you," Mitchell said. While I was inside the hospital database, I ran a cross-reference on Sarah's external communications. I found a string of encrypted emails sent from her terminal to a high-risk offshore insurance underwriter. 2 days after Patricia was buried, Sarah and Derek finalized an accelerated life insurance policy. The insured party is you. I stared at the screen. Derek was now handing Brian a large metal wrench from the canvas tool bag. I watched my son point toward the basement stairs, issuing a quiet command to his brother-in-law. Mitchell continued his words, hitting me like physical blows. "It is a $5 million policy, Richard, but it gets so much worse. The contract includes a specific double indemnity clause. If you die of natural causes, it takes months of probate and investigation to pay out the base amount. But if you die in a sudden catastrophic accident like a violent house fire or an unforeseen gas explosion, the policy bypasses standard probate. It pays out the absolute maximum amount, directly to the listed beneficiaries within 48 hours. I watched Brian take the heavy wrench and disappear down the stairs into the basement. He was going down to loosen the main valve. They were going to fill the house with invisible, highly flammable gas, leaving a slow leak that would inevitably ignite the moment the central heating furnace kicked on during the freezing Chicago night. They were meticulously building my coffin, using my own house as the wood and nails. The sheer magnitude of their calculated cruelty was entirely overwhelming to comprehend. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles completely white under the heavy, suffocating tension. Mitchell raised his voice, the panic bleeding through the digital connection. "Richard, they are not just stealing your house. If you die in an accident, they get $5 million. You cannot go back there." I held the phone to my ear, the silence in my dark apartment pressing against me like a physical weight. Mitchell's warning echoed in my mind. "You cannot go back there." I looked at the glowing monitors. Brian was still down in the basement carrying out Derek's orders with the heavy wrench. They were turning my sanctuary into a bomb. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my heart to slow its frantic beating. I told Mitchell that I was entirely safe. I explained that I was not in the house, that I was watching them from a secure location, and that I could see everything they were doing. I heard Mitchell exhale a sharp breath of relief. He told me to keep my eyes on the screen, but to listen very carefully. He had just cracked the final, deepest financial firewall, protecting Derek's offshore shell companies. The absolute truth of my son's situation was finally laid bare on his computer screen, and it was far more terrifying than simple greed. Mitchell explained that Derek was not a mastermind, orchestrating a brilliant financial heist so he could live a life of luxury. He was a drowning man grasping at anything to keep his head above water. 3 years ago, Derek's real estate development firm had taken a massive catastrophic loss on a commercial downtown project. Traditional banks completely cut off his funding. But Derek refused to admit failure. He refused to give up his lavish lifestyle. So he turned to alternative financing. Mitchell told me that Derek borrowed heavily from a shadow banking syndicate operating deep within Chicago. This was not a legitimate lending institution. This was a highly organized, violent criminal enterprise that laundered money through real estate construction projects. They gave Derek the capital he needed to keep up appearances, but their interest rates were predatory, and their collection methods were absolutely lethal. Over the last 3 years, Derek had been desperately moving money around, trying to outrun a debt that was compounding exponentially. When his own accounts ran dry, he started siphoning my retirement portfolio, forging my signatures to make the syndicate's monthly payments. But it was never enough. Mitchell read the numbers directly from the decrypted ledger. Derek currently owed the syndicate exactly $4 million, and the syndicate had completely run out of patience. They had frozen all of his remaining assets and given him a final ultimatum. Mitchell's fingers typed rapidly across his keyboard as he pulled up the final layer of encrypted communications between Derek and the syndicate's enforcers. He read the messages to me verbatim. The men Derek owed money to did not care about his excuses. They had demanded total repayment by the end of the week. If Derek did not deliver the $4 million in cash, they were not going to take him to civil court. They were going to kill him. They had explicitly threatened to torture him, to murder his wife Megan, and to erase his entire existence from the face of the earth. Derek was living on borrowed time, and the clock was ticking down to zero. That was why he needed the reverse mortgage on my house. He had used my property as a temporary collateral, a desperate bargaining chip to buy himself a few more weeks of breathing room. He convinced them that a massive payout was coming. But the reverse mortgage only covered a fraction of what he truly owed. He needed a massive, instantaneous injection of capital to save his own life. He needed $5 million. And the only way to get $5 million instantly was to activate that accelerated life insurance policy. He needed me to die in a tragic accident because my death was the only currency that could possibly pay off his debts. I stared at the high-definition video feed of my living room. Derek was pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor, chewing nervously on his thumbnail. He looked at his expensive watch every few seconds, his face pale and slick with a thin layer of cold sweat. Megan was sitting on the sofa clutching my dead wife's pearl necklace, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband had essentially placed a loaded gun to both of their heads. Sarah was standing near the basement door, waiting anxiously for her husband to finish tampering with the gas pipes. They were all complicit, bound together by a toxic mixture of arrogance and absolute terror. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with devastating clarity. Patricia had discovered the syndicate. She had seen the threats, the detailed ledgers, and the offshore accounts. She realized that her son was in bed with incredibly violent criminals. She was gathering the evidence in the storage unit to take to the federal authorities, hoping she could trade the financial data for Derek's protection. She was trying to save his life. But Sarah and Derek did not know her ultimate plan. They only knew she was building a file that would expose the stolen money. They panicked. They poisoned their own mother to stop her from going to the police, unknowingly destroying the only person trying to rescue them. I gripped the edge of the cheap, splintered wooden table in my dark apartment. A profound, chilling realization washed over me. I was not dealing with a calculated sociopath who just wanted to buy fast luxury cars and expensive designer suits. I was dealing with a deeply cornered animal. Derek was a rat trapped in a burning cage, willing to gnaw through his own family just to escape the flames. He had exactly 48 hours left to pay the syndicate $4 million in untraceable, cold, hard cash, or he was going to die a terribly painful death. And he had decided that my life was the absolute price of his survival. He was absolutely desperate, and a desperate man is the most dangerous and unpredictable creature on the entire earth. I sat in the suffocating darkness of my apartment, my eyes glued to the glowing screens, as the full weight of Mitchell's words settled into my bones. The terrifying reality of Derek's situation finally illuminated the darkest corners of Patricia's secret life. For months, I had been trying to understand why my gentle wife would hire a private investigator, why she would rent an industrial storage unit, and why she would hide a hollowed-out book in our freezer. Now the agonizing truth was laid completely bare. Patricia had not stumbled upon a simple case of embezzlement. She had uncovered the shadow syndicate. She had seen the threatening messages, the illegal money laundering, and the undeniable fact that our son was deeply entrenched with ruthless criminals. But more importantly, she had discovered the brutal ultimatum. She knew that Derek had leveraged our family home and was preparing to sacrifice my life to save his own skin. My wife, a woman who spent her existence nurturing our family, found herself standing at the edge of an impossible abyss. She was forced to make a choice that no mother should ever have to make. She had to weigh the life of the man she loved against the freedom of the boy she had brought into the world. I thought back to those long, sleepless nights she spent pacing the hardwood floors of our house. I had mistaken her profound agony for a temporary depression. But she was not depressed. She was mourning. She was mourning the absolute loss of her son long before he was ever truly gone. Patricia knew that if she confronted Derek directly, he would simply lie, or worse, the syndicate would find out and kill him immediately. She knew that if she came to me, my fiery temper would have led me straight to his doorstep, putting me directly in the crosshairs of violent men. So she chose to carry the unbearable burden entirely alone. She made the heartbreaking, unimaginable decision to sacrifice her own flesh and blood to protect the man she had promised to love, for better or for worse. She was not gathering financial records in that cold storage unit to protect her retirement funds. She was meticulously building a comprehensive ironclad criminal file to hand directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She was preparing to send our son to a federal prison, knowing it was the only place on earth where the syndicate could not reach him and the only way to keep me alive. It was an act of profound, unparalleled bravery. My beautiful Patricia had transformed herself into a silent warrior. She used the private investigator to track the offshore accounts and intercept the syndicate's communications. She bought the heavy-duty paper shredder to destroy any evidence that could lead the criminals back to our home. She set up the encrypted computer servers in Unit 11 to compile a digital dossier so complete that the federal prosecutors would not have to do anything but sign the arrest warrants. She was just days away from handing over the flash drives. She had scheduled that delayed text message to my phone as a desperate fail-safe and insurance policy in case the syndicate discovered her shadow operation before she could make it to the authorities. She knew she was playing a highly dangerous game, dancing on a razor-thin wire suspended over a canyon of pure violence. But she fundamentally underestimated the true source of the danger. She was looking out for the ruthless enforcers of the shadow banking syndicate. She never expected the fatal blow to come from inside her own home from the daughter she had raised. As I watched Sarah pacing nervously around my living room on the video monitor, the final sickening pieces of the timeline locked into place. Sarah was the administrative director at a major hospital. Her entire career was built on managing complex databases, navigating bureaucratic systems, and understanding medical protocols. Derek might have been the one with the syndicate debt, but Sarah was the calculated architect who kept his collapsing world from completely shattering. She must have noticed her mother's strange behavior. She must have followed Patricia, or perhaps she intercepted a communication with the private investigator. Somehow Sarah discovered the existence of the FBI dossier. She realized that her mother was about to completely destroy Derek's life and expose their massive financial crimes. If Derek went down, Sarah would inevitably go down with him for her role in the wire fraud and the forged legal documents. Her lucrative career, her pristine reputation, and her freedom would vanish instantly. Faced with the impending ruin of her comfortable life, my daughter did not hesitate to protect her brother's twisted scheme. Instead of seeking outside help, Sarah made a cold, calculated decision to permanently eliminate the only threat to their mutual survival. She used her extensive medical knowledge to orchestrate the perfect, untraceable murder. She knew exactly which medications Patricia took every single day. She knew her mother's cardiovascular history. Sarah used her administrative access at the hospital to procure a lethal dose of maximum-strength amphetamines, carefully selecting pills that perfectly mimicked the size and shape of Patricia's daily beta blockers. She came over for a casual family visit, slipped into the master bathroom, and quietly swapped the pills in the amber prescription bottle. She walked out of that bathroom, kissed her mother on the cheek, and left the house knowing with absolute certainty that she had just signed her mother's death warrant. Sarah murdered the woman who gave her life to protect a stolen inheritance and a criminal debt. And now she was standing in my house waiting for her husband to finish rigging the basement with natural gas so she could finally kill me too. I watched her smile on the video monitor, a chilling expression that confirmed my daughter was completely empty inside. She was a monster wearing the face of my child. I sat in the dark apartment, the phone pressed so hard against my ear that my hand began to ache. The horrifying image of my daughter slipping lethal pills into her own mother's medicine cabinet was burned into my mind. I thought I had uncovered the absolute bottom of this treacherous abyss. I thought the betrayal could not possibly go any deeper than a son stealing my life savings and a daughter committing cold-blooded murder to cover it up. But I was wrong. The silence on the telephone line stretched out for a long moment before Mitchell Pierce cleared his throat. He told me he was not completely finished. There was one final anomaly he had been working on while I was processing the tragedy of the Shadow Syndicate. He had run a deep digital trace on the original automated text messages that started this entire investigation. The messages that buzzed on Patricia's phone during her funeral. The messages that sent me to the storage unit and pointed me toward the altered prescription bottle. I asked him what he meant. I told him Patricia had scheduled those messages before she died, leaving them as a desperate trail of breadcrumbs for me to follow. Mitchell let out a heavy sigh that sounded like a physical weight dropping to the floor. He told me that Patricia did not send those text messages. He explained that the texts were sent using a sophisticated spoofing software designed to mimic her old cell phone number. The messages were not scheduled weeks in advance. They were typed and sent in real time from a secondary device while I was standing at her grave. Mitchell had managed to bypass the proxy servers and trace the original Internet Protocol address back to its physical source. He tracked the unique hardware identification number directly to a personal laptop. It was not Derek's expensive computer, and it was not Sarah's hospital terminal. The laptop belonged to Brian. The name hung in the cold air of the apartment. Brian. The quiet, unremarkable son-in-law. The man who had failed at 3 consecutive businesses and spent his life standing quietly in the shadows of my successful children. My mind raced frantically as I tried to process this impossible revelation. Why would Brian send those messages? Why would he lead me directly to the storage unit and the poisoned pills? And then the ultimate sickening twist of this entire nightmare finally snapped into perfect focus. Brian was not a victim of his wife's dominant personality, and he was certainly not a grieving family member. Brian was a parasitic opportunist who had been watching the entire conspiracy unfold from the very beginning. He lived in the same house with Sarah. He must have seen her researching the lethal amphetamines. He must have followed her or discovered the stolen files from the storage unit. Brian knew exactly what Derek and Sarah were planning to do to Patricia, and he did absolutely nothing to stop it. He let my innocent wife die. He let them commit the murder because he saw a golden opportunity to take everything for himself. Brian knew that if he went to the police with his suspicions, he would just be a witness in a messy family dispute. But if he anonymously pointed me toward the evidence, he knew my engineering mind would not rest until I tore the entire conspiracy apart. He was using me as his own personal weapon. His twisted logic was flawlessly cruel. If I took down Derek for the massive financial fraud, and I took down Sarah for the premeditated murder of her mother, both of the Caldwell heirs would be sent to federal prison for the rest of their natural lives, and who would be left standing in the rubble? Brian. He would play the role of the horrified innocent spouse. He would file for a lucrative divorce from a convicted murderer, claim damages, and position himself to inherit whatever was left of my estate. The man I had always dismissed as a pathetic loser was actually the cold, calculating mastermind pulling the strings from the absolute darkest corner of the room. My blood boiled with a rage so intense it threatened to consume me entirely. I looked away from the dark corner of the room and brought my eyes back to the glowing security monitors on the folding table. The live video feed from the basement was running in high definition. Derek and Sarah were standing near the large industrial furnace. Derek was holding the heavy metal wrench, his face twisted in deep concentration as he worked the main pressure valve of the natural gas line. Sarah was holding a flashlight, keeping the beam perfectly steady on the thick metal pipes, ensuring her brother did not make a mistake. They were meticulously rigging the system to create a slow, undetectable leak that would fill the enclosed basement with highly combustible vapor. And standing just a few feet behind them, completely out of the way of the physical labor, was Brian. His hands were casually tucked into the pockets of his jacket. He was watching his wife and his brother-in-law construct a massive bomb, knowing with absolute certainty that they were sealing their own permanent destruction. He looked completely calm, almost bored, while they performed the dirty work that he would ultimately use to destroy them. The natural gas was now flowing freely into the house. I could almost hear the quiet, deadly hiss of the vapor escaping from the loosened valve through the silent video feed. They were ready to blow the house to pieces, completely unaware that I was watching their every single move. I refused to let them win. I reached out and gently closed my laptop, the screen fading to a deep, absolute black. I picked up my heavy coat from the floor. It was time to show them exactly what a structural engineer was truly capable of. I left the laptop running on the cheap wooden table and stepped out of the apartment. The freezing night air bit through my heavy coat as I crossed the empty street. I stayed in the deep shadows of the large oak trees lining the sidewalk, moving with a silent, deliberate focus. I was not the frail old man they thought I was. I was an engineer stepping into a collapsing structure, and I knew exactly where all the load-bearing walls were located. I reached the back of my property and unlocked the heavy kitchen door using my spare key. I turned the deadbolt so slowly that it did not make a single sound. The moment I stepped inside my house, the faint, sickly sweet odor of natural gas hit my nostrils. It was already beginning to seep up through the floorboards from the basement. They were working quickly, filling the lower levels with enough combustible vapor to blow the entire foundation to dust the second the thermostat clicked on. I walked silently across the kitchen tiles, avoiding the squeaky floorboard near the refrigerator, and moved into the expansive living room. The house was pitch black, illuminated only by moonlight. I walked over to my favorite leather armchair, the one sitting in the darkest corner of the room, and lowered myself into the seat. I did not make a sound. I just sat there in the shadows, waiting in the very house they were trying to turn into my tomb. Down below, I could hear the heavy thud of their footsteps echoing on the wooden basement stairs. The basement door clicked open, and the four of them spilled out into the back hallway. Derek was breathing heavily, a sound of pure exertion and adrenaline. He told Brian to wipe down the tools and put them back in the canvas bag. Sarah's voice floated through the dark house, cold and completely detached. She reminded her brother to make sure the back door was locked, so it looked like a perfectly secure home when the fire investigators eventually arrived. Megan giggled nervously, complaining about the smell of the gas and telling them to hurry up so they could go celebrate somewhere expensive. They walked casually down the hallway and entered the living room, heading straight for the front door. They were entirely relaxed. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully murdered my wife, stolen my life savings, and orchestrated my violent death without a single consequence. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small box of wooden matches. I slid the drawer open, pulled out a single matchstick, and pressed the red tip against the rough striking strip. The loud, sharp crack of the match striking echoed like a gunshot in the silent living room. A bright orange flame flared into existence, casting a warm, flickering light across my face. I held the burning match up high in the pitch-black room. Derek froze instantly, his foot hovering mid-step. Sarah let out a sharp, terrified gasp, taking a rapid step backward and colliding hard with Brian. Megan dropped her designer purse on the hardwood floor. The four of them stood completely paralyzed, their eyes wide with absolute horror, as the tiny flame illuminated the man they thought they had just buried. I looked directly at my son, keeping my voice perfectly calm and low. I told him he always was a little sloppy with his mechanical work. I told him that if he wanted to create a proper gas explosion, he should have closed the ventilation flues first, otherwise the vapor just escapes through the chimney draft. Derek stared at me, his jaw trembling. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He stammered, asking what I was doing here, asking why I was not on the road to Montana. He tried to force a fake smile, trying to pivot back to the lie, telling me I should not be lighting matches, because there was a dangerous gas leak in the house. I slowly blew the match out. The room plunged back into darkness, lit only by the pale moonlight. I told him I knew everything. I told him I knew about the $4 million he owed to the shadow banking syndicate. I turned my eyes to Sarah, whose face had gone completely pale. I told her I knew exactly what she did to her mother's beta blockers. I told her I had the original toxicology report. And then I looked at Brian standing in the back. I thanked him for sending the automated text messages from Patricia's phone, telling him his plan to eliminate my children so he could steal my estate was a brilliant piece of cowardly engineering. The silence that followed was absolute. The masks completely shattered. There was no more fake grief. There were no more lies to tell. The terrifying reality of their situation crashed down on them. Derek realized in that exact moment that his entire plan was dead. The $5 million insurance policy was completely useless if I was sitting right here fully aware of his crimes. He was out of time, out of money, and the syndicate was coming for his life. The panic in Derek's eyes instantly twisted into a dark, murderous rage. He was a cornered animal with absolutely nothing left to lose. He let out a vicious, guttural scream, dropping the heavy canvas tool bag to the floor. He lunged across the dark living room, his hands reaching violently for my throat, ready to finish the job himself with his bare hands. But before his fingers could even brush the collar of my coat, the entire living room was suddenly flooded with blinding, brilliant light. The heavy floor lamps and the overhead chandelier snapped on. Mitchell Pierce and 3 armed federal agents stepped out from the hallway, their weapons drawn and leveled directly at my son's chest. He froze. The blinding light washed over the living room, completely freezing Derek right in his tracks. His outstretched hands, fingers curled like claws, hung uselessly in the air inches from my shocked face. The 3 federal agents moved with terrifying, absolute speed and precision. They fanned out across the hardwood floor, their dark tactical vests contrasting sharply against the elegant decor of my home. The lead agent, a tall man with steel-gray hair, barked a loud command that echoed off the high ceilings, ordering everyone to keep their hands visible and to step away from the center of the room. Derek stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the rug. The sheer shock on his face was a perfect mask of arrogant entitlement, suddenly shattered by the crushing weight of reality. Megan let out a piercing, hysterical shriek, dropping instantly to her knees and covering her pale face with her trembling hands. Pure, uncontrollable chaos erupted within mere seconds. Derek was the first to find his voice. He began to scream, his frantic words loud and incredibly desperate. He pointed a violently trembling finger at me, shouting to the federal agents that I was a senile, crazy old man. He claimed that I was suffering from severe dementia, that I had lost my mind with grief over Patricia, and that I was making up insane conspiracy theories to ruin his successful life. He desperately tried to straighten his designer jacket, adopting the smooth, persuasive tone he used in his many fraudulent real estate deals. He told the agents they were making a terrible mistake, that there was a simple gas leak in the house, and he was just trying to safely turn off the main valve to protect his sick, confused father. Sarah immediately and flawlessly followed his lead. The cold, calculated murderer vanished, replaced instantly by the weeping, completely devastated daughter. She collapsed onto the sofa next to Megan, sobbing loudly and uncontrollably. She cried out that they were only here to check on me, that they loved me, and that Mitchell Pierce was a lying fraud who had manipulated my broken heart. She begged the lead agent to lower his weapon, claiming her brother was innocent, and that our family was just going through a tragic, unfortunate misunderstanding. It was a spectacular performance polished by years of manipulating hospital patients and grieving families. But I was not a weak, grieving victim anymore. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the legal document they had forced me to sign just a few short hours ago. I walked slowly over to the mahogany coffee table and threw the forged power of attorney document down. It landed with a soft, final thud. I looked at Derek, my voice cutting through his frantic shouting like a surgical blade. I told him he should always inspect the foundation of a contract before he tries to build his life upon it. I explained that I used a fake middle initial and deliberately altered the stroke pattern of my signature. I told him the document he used to try and finalize his loans with the shadow banking syndicate was completely, legally void. The blood drained entirely from Derek's pale face. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He stared at the piece of paper on the table as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike his throat. Before he could recover, Mitchell Pierce stepped forward. He pulled a small digital audio recorder from his coat pocket and pressed the silver button. The clear, undeniable voices of my own children filled the bright living room. The audio feed from the hidden camera played back Sarah, asking if the insurance agent had confirmed the $5 million policy. It played Derek confirming the activation. It played their sick discussion about tampering with the gas line to make my murder look like a tragic accident. Sarah stopped crying instantly. Her fake tears evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer, unmasked terror. She stared at the black device in Mitchell's hand, realizing that her own arrogant words had just sealed her fate inside a federal prison cell. I turned my attention away from my 2 children. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a subtle movement near the back hallway. Brian, the quiet mastermind, was slowly inching his way toward the back door, hoping the chaos would cover his escape. I called out his name, my voice echoing sharply in the tense room. He froze, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I told the federal agents not to let him leave. I reached into my pocket again and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It was the digital protocol trace Mitchell had printed out in the storage unit. I looked Brian directly in the eye and told him I knew exactly what he did. I read the unique hardware identification number of his personal laptop out loud to the room. I explained that Brian had sent the automated text messages at the funeral. I told Derek and Sarah that their quiet brother-in-law knew all about their plot to murder Patricia. I explained that Brian let their mother die so he could use the evidence to put them both behind bars and steal the entire estate for himself. The revelation hit the room like a massive physical shockwave. Derek slowly turned his head to look at Brian. The horrifying realization that he had been manipulated and betrayed by the man he constantly mocked completely broke whatever was left of his fragile sanity. Derek let out a roar of absolute fury and lunged across the room, not at me, but directly at Brian. Sarah shrieked, jumping off the leather sofa and grabbing her husband by the collar, screaming that he was a traitor. They turned on each other instantly, tearing into one another like a pack of starving wild dogs right in front of the armed federal agents. Derek froze entirely in his tracks, the terrifying reality of the three heavy black barrels pointing directly at his chest, finally overriding his blind, panicked rage. The lead agent did not hesitate. He stepped forward, grabbing Derek by the shoulder, and spun him around, slamming him hard against the drywall of the living room. The heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Derek's wrists echoed loudly in the silence of the house. It was a sharp, final sound that severed my son from the privileged, arrogant life he had tried to maintain. The agent pulled Derek backward, shoving him roughly into a dining chair, while the other two agents moved swiftly to secure the rest of the room. Sarah did not even try to fight or run. The moment the agent grabbed her arms, she went limp, her knees buckling beneath her. She wept loudly, a pathetic gasping sound as the cold steel locked around her wrists. She had used her hospital access to murder her own mother and orchestrate an insurance fraud, and now she was crying like a helpless child. Brian, who had just been attacked by Derek, was dragged up from the floor. He was bleeding slightly from his lip, his eyes darting frantically around the room as the third agent secured his hands behind his back. The lead federal agent stood in the center of my living room and began to read them their Miranda rights in a loud, steady, firm voice. He listed the charges they were now facing: wire fraud, extortion, attempted arson, premeditated murder. I turned my back on them and walked slowly out the front door, stepping onto the porch. The cold Chicago rain had returned, falling in a steady mist. The quiet suburban street was illuminated by the bright lights of half a dozen federal squad cars parked haphazardly across the wet asphalt. Neighbors had turned on their porch lights, stepping out in their bathrobes, watching in stunned silence as my neighborhood was transformed into a chaotic crime scene. But the police vehicles were not the only lights arriving at the house. Two heavy-duty tow trucks rumbled loudly down the street, their engines cutting through the rain. Mitchell Pierce had been thorough. He had contacted the Asset Forfeiture Division and the financial creditors. The first tow truck backed up directly to the luxury Porsche sitting at the curb. I watched the operator quickly hook heavy steel chains to the wheels. Megan, who had not been arrested but was being detained for questioning, was escorted out onto the porch by a female agent. When Megan saw the tow truck lifting her car off the pavement, she lost her mind. She screamed at the operators, crying that the car belonged to her, completely ignoring the fact that her husband was being hauled out of the house in handcuffs. Her pathetic vanity was the only thing she truly cared about. The agents dragged Derek and Sarah out through the front door, their heads bowed against the rain. They paused near the edge of the porch, waiting for the officers to open the heavy doors of the armored transport vehicles. I slowly walked down the brick stairs, my boots splashing softly in the puddles on the driveway. I stopped right in front of Derek. The rain was slicking his hair down across his forehead. His suit was soaked and wrinkled. He looked pathetic. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, filled with a desperate, frantic terror. He began to beg. He pleaded with me, his voice cracking, calling me Dad, asking me to tell them it was all just a terrible mistake. He swore he would pay the money back. He promised he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me. He asked for my forgiveness, hoping that somewhere deep inside my chest, the loving father he had so violently manipulated would rise up to protect him one last time. I stood there, in the freezing rain, feeling absolutely nothing for the broken man standing before me. The love I once had for my son had died the exact moment I realized he had sacrificed his own mother to a criminal syndicate. I looked him dead in his panicked eyes, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or mercy. I told him I spent 40 years engineering massive buildings to withstand earthquakes, hurricanes, and the heaviest burdens of time. I asked him why he ever thought he could successfully tear down my foundation. I leaned in slightly, letting the cold truth wash over him. I just engineered your prison cell. Derek opened his mouth, but no words came out. He simply stared at me, completely broken, realizing that the old clueless man he had mocked had just systematically destroyed his entire existence. The lead federal agent placed a heavy hand on the back of Derek's neck, pushing his head down, and shoved him roughly into the dark back seat of the squad car. The heavy door slammed shut with a definitive hollow thud. I watched them load Sarah into a separate vehicle, her sobs completely muffled by the thick bulletproof glass. Brian was placed into a third car, his head hanging low in absolute defeat. The convoy of federal vehicles slowly pulled away from the curb, their red and blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement as they drove down the quiet street, disappearing into the dark, rainy night. The tow trucks followed closely behind, dragging the last remnants of their stolen luxury away forever. The neighbors slowly retreated back into their warm homes, turning off their porch lights one by one. I stood alone in the driveway for a long time, letting the cold rain wash the exhaustion from my face. The war was finally over. I turned around and walked slowly back up the brick stairs. I stepped through the front door and locked the heavy deadbolt behind me. The house was profoundly, entirely quiet. The morning after the arrests, the sun rose over Chicago with a brilliant clarity I had not seen since the day I buried my wife. I walked through the empty rooms of my house, the silence no longer feeling oppressive. Instead, it felt like a deep, cleansing breath. The heavy weight of deceit had been forcibly ripped from my life, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. Over the next 12 months, I focused entirely on the deliberate process of healing. I started by boxing up the physical remnants of the family I used to know. I packed away the photographs of Derek and Sarah, not out of anger, but out of a quiet acceptance that those smiling children no longer existed. They had been replaced by strangers I did not want to remember. Once the house was cleared of its ghosts, I put the property on the market. I realized that holding on to the physical structure where so much dark history had unfolded would only anchor me to the past. A young couple with a newborn baby bought the house a few months later. As I handed them the keys, I felt a genuine smile cross my face. I was giving the foundation I had built with my own hands to a new family, hoping they would fill those rooms with the kind of love and honesty my own children had so violently discarded. I used the proceeds from the sale along with the remains of my retirement portfolio Mitchell miraculously managed to recover to purchase a quiet cabin near a large lake in Wisconsin. The legal proceedings took the better part of the year. I sat in the front row of the federal courtroom every single day, watching the wheels of absolute justice grind my children down to dust. Derek was convicted of wire fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. The shadow banking syndicate he owed money to was also dismantled using the digital dossier Patricia had so bravely compiled in her storage unit. Derek was sentenced to 40 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Sarah faced an even harsher reality. The medical evidence of her mother's poisoning was irrefutable. She was stripped of her medical licenses and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Brian, who tried to play the innocent whistleblower, was convicted of extortion and conspiracy, earning himself 20 years behind bars. Megan was left with absolutely nothing, returning to her parents in disgrace after the government seized every asset she possessed. I did not attend their sentencing hearings to gloat. I went because I needed them to look out into the gallery and see the man they thought they could so easily destroy. I needed them to know that my foundation never cracked. But justice in a courtroom was not enough to honor the ultimate sacrifice my wife had made. Patricia gave her life trying to protect her family from the consequences of financial abuse. I decided that her profound bravery needed to become a permanent shield for others. I took the remaining millions from the recovered accounts and legally established a new nonprofit organization. I named it the Patricia Foundation. We built a dedicated network of forensic accountants, private investigators, and aggressive legal experts. Our singular mission is to provide free, immediate legal defense for elderly parents who are actively suffering from financial exploitation and abuse at the hands of their own children. Every single week, I sit in my quiet office overlooking the lake reviewing case files for our legal team. We step in when the elderly are coerced into signing away their homes. We intervene when greedy children try to forge medical documents to declare their parents legally incompetent. We freeze stolen bank accounts, and we put abusive relatives behind bars. We give a powerful voice to the incredibly vulnerable people who thought their only option was to suffer in silence. I found a new purpose in protecting the foundations of other families, ensuring that no mother or father ever has to feel cornered by the children they sacrificed everything to raise. Life has a strange way of breaking you down, only to rebuild you into something much stronger. I lost my wife to a terrible betrayal, and I had to cut off my own flesh and blood to survive. But I did survive. And though a part of my heart will always carry the scar of what I lost, my soul celebrates the freedom I gained. I learned that true family is not defined by blood or a shared last name. It is defined by absolute respect, unwavering loyalty, and genuine love. If you are listening to this right now, I want you to remember something very important. Never let anyone use your age or your kindness as a weapon against you. You earned your dignity. And if the people you love try to strip that dignity away, do not be afraid to defend yourself. Blood is never enough to justify abuse. Knowing when to walk away from toxic people, even your own children, is an ultimate act of personal survival. You have the power to engineer your own rescue. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my story. I hope my journey has given you the courage to face your own battles. Did you like my story, and which city are you listening from? Let us meet in the comments section below. I try to read every message, and your support means the world to me. If you liked this story, you can support my journey by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more powerful life stories to this channel. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I am looking forward to your comments. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There is so much more on my channel. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time. With absolute respect.